Good morning, students. Thanks all for tuning in. Another beautiful day here at the Eleanor Roosevelt E-STEM Academy. Blue skies, golden sunshine. You know, today I've been thinking about I don't mind how that whole distance instruction thing has worked. I don't mind it. I think that it's I've done as best of a job as I know how to do with it. But it's not as fun as real teaching, part of the reason, at least for me, that I've been able to do this for so long is because, you make connections with kids in your class and you feel like, I don't know, not that they're like your friends necessarily, but you're excited to show up and work with them. And you don't have that in the distance instruction thing, not with the same level of personability, I guess. It's kind of like less fun doing lectures it's just a lot less fun doing lectures online. So but at some point I'm sure we'll return back to the classroom. And what's up, Arnav? Arnav, you found proof of the food shortage. Very good. I can on a scale of 1 to 10, Arnav, how heated are you coming in today? Like coming in hot. Like where's your energy level today? Yesterday, on Tuesday, it was a definite 10. So I'm just wondering where's your argumentation level coming in today? Let's, good, that's good. Trying to get fired up so I can get the schoolwork done. Heck yeah. Do it. All right, let's pop over to this desktop here. We left off talking about Napoleon and some changes with France that are happening with Napoleon. And all right, so this we'll put here. Okay. Now, one of the things, actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up this right here. There's a slide I want to talk about that I use in my AP Euro class, and I'm going to open up that slide really quickly here. It's got to be on a different PowerPoint. 1 second. That's not right. Let's see here. How come I can't find it? There should be a slide in here. Maybe I'm just moving through it too quickly. Huh. For whatever reason, I can't find this one slide that I thought that I was going to pull up really easily, but that's okay. Not a big deal. That's fine, Arnav. I'll extend it an hour for you. That's fine. 1 second. Yeah, if you haven't handed in your French Rev vocab yet, then I'm just going to extend this out for folks so that you can hand it in by the end of class today. Let's do this. Edit. Make it do it 10 a.m. Should still be open, Arnav. I don't know what you're talking about, but that's fine. Revolutionary patterns, images. That's not what I want. Revolution, radical to conservative, shift. Huh. I have somewhere, and it's really annoying that I can't find it right now, because it's a great way of showing how the patterns of revolution work, okay? But I can't find it, so that's fine. We'll just skip that, what I was going to say about that. Basically, if I was to try and demonstrate it using paint, which is going to look like garbage, all right, revolutions kind of go through an interesting pattern or sequence, okay, where they swing really far radical, okay? They start off kind of moderate, all right? So if we take the French Revolution, okay, if we take the French Revolution starting in 1789, okay, the beginnings of the French Revolution were meant to institute a constitutional monarchy in France. That was the original goal. They weren't trying to overthrow the government and establish a republic, okay? And by the way, the same was true in the English Civil. I gotta keep my voice down. I'm already yelling so loud. This is what I do. I come here. I'm so used to talking really loudly, and stuff like that, that it's hard for me to realize there's no one else in the room here. You guys can hear me just fine with me not raising my voice so high. So I have to keep my voice down. The idea here is that in 1789, when the French Revolution begins, they're trying for a relatively conservative change, okay? And remember, I drew this arrow off to the right, okay? Because the right, just like in the National Assembly, okay, that's conservative, okay? Conservative, meaning that they want very few changes. Okay, they want very few changes in the beginning. But as time goes on, the revolution has a tendency to move towards being more radical. Okay, so, you know, the revolution swung way over to the other side where there's a bunch of changes under the National Convention and Robespierre, the Reign of Terror, right? That's the most radical phase of the French Revolution, the National Convention, the Reign of Terror, all the people dying by way of guillotine, all the stuff that your vocab terms were about this time. And then with Napoleon, it swings back and becomes more moderate conservative again, okay? And indeed, throughout Napoleon's reign, because he ultimately ends up establishing an empire, okay, it has a rather conservative feel to it because it feels a lot like, you know, a monarchy or a dictatorship or something like that. So why am I bringing this up? It has to do with the fact that all revolutions have a tendency to follow this exact same pattern. They start off pretty conservative. They have a radical phase, like in the English Civil War. The radical part was where Oliver Cromwell took over the government, right? And then after Oliver Cromwell took over and killed the king, then it swung conservative again under the military dictatorship that Cromwell set up, okay? And then after that dictatorship was over, they restore the king, Charles II. All right, the French Revolution starts off pretty conservative. They wanted to keep the king. Eventually, it swings really far radical. They get rid of the king. There's a whole bunch of sweeping changes, and then it sweeps back the other direction again and becomes more conservative towards the end under Napoleon. So when we talk here, okay, when we talk here about the changes that Napoleon is making, the changes that Napoleon is making are going to be changes to try to create stability, create law and order in France, and end the lawlessness and the corruption that had been plaguing the French Revolution under Robespierre and others. Okay, and so the Napoleonic Code was a brand new legal code established by Napoleon, and it eliminated a lot of injustices within the French system. But again, it limited liberty, it promoted order, it promoted authority over individual rights. You know, Napoleon basically was of the opinion, like, okay, yeah, the revolution was necessary, but let's not go too crazy, okay? If all we do is care about individual rights, what ends up happening is you create a situation very much like, you know, the Reign of Terror, right? Where it's like it just got too chaotic, too crazy, and so Napoleon is going to be instituting changes to try to, you know, create conditions that will preserve order and stability and law and so on. So as a result of that, freedom of speech and press were restricted, and they restored slavery in the French Caribbean, as I mentioned last class. We finished it up by talking about the Haitian Revolution last class, and then in 1804, Napoleon makes himself Emperor of France. Okay, Emperor of the French Empire. And, okay, so it's in the context, Arnav, of individual rights being put ahead of the people. So, in other words, if everybody is just allowed to do whatever, individual rights, act however they want, and so on, you get a system of anarchy where people, there is no regard for like the public. Okay, like all the regard lies with the individual. If you put all of the emphasis on the individual, that means that there's no emphasis on the group. And it makes a situation where it becomes very difficult to handle issues, okay? Because people, it's kind of chaotic, right? And there are problems that are going on in France that affect whole groups of people, and those problems were exceedingly difficult to address under a more chaotic phase of the French Revolution. But we're talking about individual rights, right? Law and order will be thrown out the window. Yeah, somewhat. I mean, in a situation where individual rights, like I want you to just consider this philosophy that so many people have today of just, I got mine, right? I got mine. Meaning like, I don't care what anyone else gets. At least I got what I got, I don't care, what, sucks for them that they got into a car accident, sucks for them that they, whatever. And if the only emphasis is ever on the individual, then the group's needs are sacrificed because the individual's looking out for themselves. They're not looking out for the group. And that's the problem. So when Napoleon becomes emperor, the French voters supported him in doing that. Napoleon walked down the aisle of Notre Dame Cathedral at the end. And Gareth, you're absolutely right about that. People ratted each other out to make them look good or save their own skin. You're 100% right, and that was a major problem. That's kind of one of the things that I was referencing there. Nice comment there. Napoleon walked down the aisle of Notre Dame Cathedral. You might have heard about Notre Dame Cathedral. It burned partially down a couple years ago, or about a year and a half ago, I think. No, actually, it was a while ago now. It was about 2 years ago now, and it's really sad. I mean, to be honest with you, Notre Dame Cathedral will probably not even be rebuilt by the time that I die. It'll take probably a century to rebuild it, but so it was a pretty significant thing, and it was very, very much a bummer for the French people. But right in that cathedral, which I've been in before, is where Napoleon crowned himself emperor. And the Pope was supposed to be the one who crowned him. Okay, so he got to the end, the Pope was holding this crown. And as the Pope went to go put the crown on Napoleon's head, he grabbed the crown out of the Pope's hands and put it on his own head. And probably the Pope was looking at that like, holy smokes, who does this guy think he is? I'm the Pope. And this is, why does he do it? The symbolism of it is no one puts a crown on Napoleon's head except for Napoleon. And he did not want it to be perceived by the French people that he was subordinating himself to the Pope. He had invited the Pope back into France, but had established separation of church and state, and he did not want people to perceive him as an emperor crowned by the Pope, whose power is derived from God. He wanted himself to be viewed as an emperor who was not bound to the church, who did not derive his power from God, but derived his power from the people. So if they took away individual rights, where did the transfer go and what did they do with it? When I say take away individual rights, what I mean is clamping down on the ability to just publish whatever you want. For example, The People's Friend, the paper by Jean-Paul Marat, which resulted in the deaths of a whole lot of people by calling them out unfairly. And so the idea is taking away individual rights makes it easier for stability to be maintained because there becomes legal ramifications if you are doing things that upset the stability of the state. And so the transfer goes to, I guess, the government at this time under Napoleon. But you know, the other part about this, Arnav, that you might be failing to consider a bit is that after a certain amount of time where chaos is reigning free, people get very tired and they get very fearful as a group. And so there's actually a desire. I know that this is going to sound counterintuitive, but to some extent there is a desire to be controlled, okay? Take a look at, you know, there's a whole bunch of, you know, conservatives today in government who are really advocating for empowering the police, okay? Because in the name of individual rights, okay, in the name of individual rights, people have been protesting the economic conditions that are seemingly stacked against them, right? And unfairness in the system. So we have like the Black Lives Matter protests, and we have all these things. These are things that people are able to do as a product of individual rights, right? But for other people, it's really scary. And it scares them that there's these groups of people that are angry, that are protesting, many of them peaceably, others of them more violently. And so there's this press. There's this press to implement control so that chaos won't just reign free and people won't be out rioting and looting and stuff like that. If we all just valued straight up individual rights, absent of any sort of law and order, you could see how that would frighten a whole lot of people, and so anyhow, hopefully that makes some sense to you. There's always, you know, amongst groups, doesn't matter where you're at, whether it's America or France or anywhere, it's not a problem that's exclusive to America. Anytime that things start to get really revolutionary, really hot, really rebellious, okay, in the name of individual rights, individual freedoms, there's an equal and opposite reaction to that from people who don't want to see things change from how they were before. And they're going to call for controlling those people using apparatuses of the state, like, for example, police, right, or the military, or whatever, okay? And so, you know, Arnav, what you're advocating for is individual rights, which is great, I get it. We need to value individual rights here in the United States. But even the United States does not give unlimited individual rights, because unlimited individual rights would ultimately result in a whole lot of upheaval and a whole lot of people within the state who would have equally and opposite reacted to that by saying, no, we need to implement the ability to control to maintain the status quo. That's everywhere. That's everywhere in history, okay? You're always going to have people that when they see change happening, they're going to resist it. And the main way that they go about resisting it is by implementing more state control. So, I hope that clears up that topic for you a little bit. Moving forward, Emperor Napoleon wants to expand his power to all of Europe and regain power in America as well. And his efforts in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, fail from both disease and from the fact that there's the Haitian Revolution going on there, and that the slaves overthrew the whole colony and took it over and started running it themselves. So what Napoleon does is very quickly he realizes that his attempts to re-enslave these folks in Haiti fails. He realizes that he's not going to be able to recolonize North America, so he cuts his losses. He had wanted to expand his power and regain power in America, but he cuts his losses and he sells the Louisiana Territory, the Louisiana Purchase, to the United States President Thomas Jefferson in 1803, third president of the United States, for $15 million. All right? And he turns his full attention, Napoleon turns his full attention to Europe. He ends up annexing the Austrian Netherlands, which is Belgium, and modern-day Belgium, and then parts of Italy as well. And he ends up setting up a puppet government in Switzerland, which is bordering France to the kind of southeast. Okay, now here's this image here, and you might find this kind of a comical representation because this isn't like a meme, although it would probably make for a pretty good meme. And the idea here being, you know, here's Louis XVI on the left. He was a divine right absolutist monarch who lived at Versailles. Okay, and you can see the symbolism. All of these things have symbolism. So, for example, this blue with the yellow symbol on there, that yellow symbol is called a fleur-de-lis. Fleur-de-lis. And this fleur-de-lis is a symbol of France. Okay. But the color of the French flag for centuries had been blue, right? Had been blue with the old fleur-de-lis on it. That was the symbol of the French Bourbon dynasty. And you had here, the crown and the scepter and wand and all this stuff. And each of these things, and a throne behind him, each of these things has symbolism, okay? It all has symbolism. And you'll note that over here on the right, Napoleon, who comes to power, in 1799, just maybe about 6 years or so after they kill their king, has himself depicted in a portrait with a lot of the same symbolism to legitimize himself. In case you're wondering, why would he depict himself so similarly to Louis XVI? Well, in some ways, it's a way of trolling Louis XVI. He does this to demonstrate his legitimacy as a monarch, even though he is not of royal blood. He's of noble blood, but he's not of royal lineage, and so he was not considered by other royalists a legitimate monarch in France who still retained their loyalty to the king's family. And so Napoleon has this painted of him to depict him in not only a very legitimate ruler fashion, but he invokes the use of this deep color of red. All right? And so this I'll respond to you in a second, Arnav. This color of red is a very Roman imperial color. Okay, it's a very Roman imperial color. And so he does this to depict himself not only as a legitimate ruler, but as almost like a Caesar-like figure, all right, like a Roman emperor. And that's why he's depicted in red there, is because that was the color of the Roman legion. And here you can see all of the same symbols of the pillow. This is like I forget what they call this, like a globulus orbis or something like that. And then the wand and the scepter and the throne in the background there. Okay. Arnav, to speak to your point, I see where you're coming from about the safety part, but in no way can control be over rights. Arguments are a part of life. It's bound to happen, government or not. Having a government won't change people's sides. It's got to be embraced and come to an agreement. Yeah, if you're talking about just having arguments, okay, yeah, that's one thing. I'm more talking about where does the line for criminality get drawn? Okay, governments. So, in other words, at what point do we sacrifice law and order for individual rights? At what point does criminality enter into the conversation, right? And so if you're saying that people rightfully have the right to peacefully protest, I completely agree with you, right? If you're saying that people have the right to go out and just do whatever they want at any given time, just because they're individuals, I don't agree with that. People don't have the right to just act however they want, because people don't live in a vacuum. They live amongst other people. And so if people are acting with only a regard for their own individual wants or desires or impulses, okay, that would be a chaotic society, and it would result in a lot of crime, and it would result in a lot of chaos. And so the question is, at what point do you draw the line and say, okay, here's the rights that we're going to respect, but here's some basic guidelines for how society has to operate so that it's not chaotic and anarchical, right? And the fact of the matter, Arnav, whether you agree with it or not, the fact of the matter is that most people want government because government offers a semblance of control that people crave. Okay, people crave control. They crave having a system that creates predictability, stability, and so on. And so you're never going to get into a situation where people across the board agree for long periods of time to having outright chaos. It's just not going to happen. Not to mention, if we were to value individual rights on, say, things like littering, what would happen to the environment? If anyone could just dump stuff wherever they wanted to, the environment's going to go, to trash. And so why do we have a government? To create laws so that people don't just litter, or, companies don't just dump toxic waste into rivers and stuff. If it was all about individual rights, companies would do that. All right? They don't care about disposing of things properly. They care about making money. So there needs to be laws in place that have some semblance of control over society. Otherwise, you're going to very quickly find yourself in a very not nice place to live on a lot of different levels. So it's not as simple of an argument as you might think it is to say, oh, individual rights have to be valued at all times over the government. It's just simply, it's just not taking into consideration the totality of the argument. All right, moving forward here. Europe fears Napoleon. Britain thinks Napoleon is dangerous, which he is because he's a military genius, and so they ally themselves with Russia, Austria, and Sweden against France. And Napoleon just crushes the opposition, okay? So we see these wars against Napoleon pick back up after Britain declares war. And he's very, very successful in a lot of these battles, but not all of them. His successes forced the rulers of Austria, Prussia, and Russia to sign peace treaties, but not Britain. Then, frankly, Napoleon, by this point, has established the largest empire since Rome. He was able to subdue all of these nations and force them to sign peace treaties. He installs his own, trusted family members and other people into positions of power in these states that he subdues. So basically you have like puppet governments in some of these states where, like Napoleon subdued Spain and made his brother Joseph Bonaparte the, and so on. I can see what you mean, and to add, the line is crossed when it's purposely harming someone else, like murder. Well, there's a lot of ways where people can harm other people without intentionally doing it, and shouldn't we be cautious of those? All right, moving forward here. The Battle of Trafalgar. This is the first major battle, and it was a naval battle, meaning it took place on the seas. This is the first major battle that Napoleon lost, okay? And this naval defeat at the Battle of Trafalgar was more important than really all of his land victories combined, because what happened is this happened off the southwest coast of Spain, kind of in between Europe and Africa on the high seas. And there was a British military leader, admiral, vice admiral, his name was Horatio Nelson, he's on the next slide, that was commanding this attack. Now, in the Battle of Trafalgar, the British ships basically went in and disrupted the French fleet and destroyed them. And the British Navy went on to dominate the globe for the next 100 years after this battle. This battle really put a major damper on the French Navy's ability to be able to counter the British Royal Navy. And Napoleon ultimately, after losing this naval battle, the Battle of Trafalgar, had to find new ways to attack England, which is going to be really hard because England is an island, okay? So the only way to get to England is to use ships, and now England has just demonstrated their naval dominance. So getting to England and fighting against England is going to be really, really difficult. And in this Battle of Trafalgar, even though Horatio Nelson is credited as being the guy who really led the British Royal Navy to victory against Napoleon's naval forces, Horatio Nelson was killed during the battle. He was shot by a French sniper during the battle and died. And, Horatio Nelson here on the right, you can see his sleeve is pinned to his shirt because in a previous battle he had already lost his arm. He also had a fake eye. He had lost one of his eyes in a naval battle. So he was already kind of a mess beforehand, but in this battle he got shot and was killed in the battle. But despite the fact that the British lost one of their youngest, most well-liked vice admirals in their navy, they still nonetheless ended up victorious in the Battle of Trafalgar, and this is a painting depicting that. Now, if you go to London today, London, the capital of England, you can go to a center in Trafalgar, in London called Trafalgar Square. Okay, Trafalgar Square, and in Trafalgar Square, it's kind of in front of a giant museum, and I think it's in front of the National Archives, if I'm not mistaken, or very close to it. But anyhow, the Battle of Trafalgar is commemorated in the middle of London, where you have a major spire dedicated to the battle of Horatio Nelson was killed in, but that ultimately defeated Napoleon's naval forces. By 1812, okay, this French Empire, the thing that makes it tricky is that as much as Napoleon has gone about and subdued much of Europe and implemented puppet governments in a lot of Europe and is able to keep his power through military threats and can control like a puppet much of Europe, all right, get them to do what he wants them to do. It's very, very large, but it's highly unstable. And really, if we're honest, the French Empire in its greatest size, unlike the Roman Empire, which lasted for, basically a millennium, the French Empire lasts for only about 5 years due to some major mistakes Napoleon made. And so that brings us to the next section here. And that is the beginning of the end for Napoleon, the fall of Napoleon. Napoleon was really worried what would happen to his empire when he died, okay, the French Empire. And remember, the French Empire rests mostly in Europe across these places that the French have militarily and politically subdued. But his first wife, Josephine Beauharnais was her name, failed to produce a son. And very similar to other kings of Europe, Napoleon was looking to have a child who would become a legitimate ruler to take his place. And so he divorced Josephine Beauharnais, despite the fact that he didn't really want to. In fact, he was truly, truly in love with Josephine Beauharnais, and she was a couple of years older than Napoleon, but he loved her and continued to love her even in his new marriage. He marries, of all people, get this, and this had to do with creating a legitimate monarch to succeed him, okay, or a legitimate ruler to succeed him. He marries Austrian royalty, Marie Antoinette's niece. Marie Louise was her name. He didn't really care much for Marie Louise, but she was somebody who was potentially going to be able to offer him a son, and she does. She gives birth to Napoleon II. But unlike Napoleon I, Napoleon II doesn't live very long. He's kind of a sickly child, and it's pretty big shoes to fill in terms of being able to maintain the same level of control that Napoleon was able to. But it wouldn't even come to that because Napoleon II never really has the opportunity to rule. And as a byproduct of that, there are going to be a number of costly mistakes that Napoleon makes that ultimately lead to Napoleon II never really having the opportunity to rule. So the next segment of what I'm going to be talking about here are 3 major mistakes that Napoleon made that cost him his entire French Empire. We have to understand that as Napoleon became more powerful in Europe, remember that phrase, absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? Napoleon had a desire for power that just could not be satiated, it could not be satisfied. It's an unquenchable thirst for power. And he absolutely wants to destroy the British. And in the process of trying to do so, he makes 3 major mistakes, okay? Mistake number 1 that we're going to talk about is something called the Continental System. The Continental System. And the first major mistake that Napoleon made is he tries to set up a blockade. What a blockade is now remember, they had already by this point lost the Battle of Trafalgar, and the British Navy had demonstrated its dominance over the French Navy. And so what Napoleon tries to do is to set up a blockade where they use warships to block ports. And the reason that they did this was to try to prevent trade and communication from Britain to the rest of continental Europe. So that's how it gets the name Continental System, is basically Napoleon's trying to lock down the continent against British trade and stop British ships from being able to sail into European ports and conduct trade that would have benefited the British. And so the policy of blocking England from trade and communication was called the Continental System. But the problem was, as I mentioned, the French Navy by this point is just not as powerful as the British Navy is, and their blockade just wasn't tight enough. There's tons and tons and tons of ports all across the European continent, and the French couldn't block all of them at once. So the British, found ways around it to smuggle goods into Europe at various ports. And the British actually ultimately ended up responding with their own blockade against Napoleon. And so now Napoleon's ships weren't able to leave their ports, which was actually a stronger blockade. It was a counter blockade, and the British blockade was stronger, and it actually worked. So the Continental System ended up actually locking Napoleon in instead of blocking the British out. Okay, and this was going to create problems for him with trade and so on and so forth, because ships are the primary way of transporting stuff around at this time. And if you can't get your ships around the continent because the British are blockading your ports from you being able to leave them, that's a major problem. The second major mistake. So the first major mistake that Napoleon makes is called the Continental System. The second major mistake that Napoleon makes is called the Peninsular War. The Peninsular War. And this was where Napoleon decided, one of the few places that he wasn't able to take was Portugal. Tiny little Portugal. Okay, and if you remember where Portugal is on a map, it's directly next to Spain. Spain borders France, but there's a mountain range between France and Spain called the Pyrenees. And so Napoleon had already subdued Spain, but they weren't able to take Portugal, and this really bothered Napoleon. He wanted to be able to take Portugal, even though, frankly, it probably wouldn't have done a whole lot for him. So what Napoleon does is he sends an invasion force through Spain. He sends his military, his land military, through Spain, and then
this is all just to take Portugal. And the Spanish people are like, what the heck? You've already subdued us, and now you're marching a military through our lands. They're not going to tolerate that. So the Spanish people start protesting. And Napoleon had already removed the Spanish king and replaced him with his brother Joseph Bonaparte. And so now Napoleon's brother is technically the king of Spain. The Spanish people were freaking out. They started using guerrillas. What I mean by guerrillas is not like, 800-pound silverback gorillas, although that would have been awesome. Okay? When I say they start using guerrillas, they start using guerrilla-type warfare, guerrilla-style warfare tactics. And the way that guerrilla warfare works, one of the things that you have to understand about the way that battles were fought back in history is that countries in Europe would gather their militaries at a location, and their militaries would go through a very known, orderly process of battle. Okay? And this process of battle was one that was very highly organized. Okay? Guerrilla warfare is very disorganized. Guerrilla warfare is people fighting, from hidden places, setting traps, attacking people from behind. It's not organized. It's not like the types of battles that Napoleon was used to. A lot of the same tactics were used by the American patriots against the British in the American Revolution. Had the American patriots tried to use the same tactics of taking the battlefield against the British military and the Prussians, the Hessians, they would have lost every single battle because they didn't have as well organized or as disciplined of a military force. So the way that the Americans were able to whittle away at the British military was by using these very, cutthroat tactics, using snipers, setting traps, running up in small pockets and stabbing people and then running off into the forest and stuff like that. And the Spanish people start using these kind of guerrilla warfare tactics to attack the French forces that are marching through Spain, and Napoleon doesn't know what to do with it because it's not a style of battle that Napoleon had ever had any contact with before. So then England sends troops, because they're still at war with the French. England sends their troops into the Spanish ports to help the Spanish fight against the French. And so you can see here in this kind of artistic depiction, and it's not a very high quality image, but you can kind of get my point. Here's some French troops. That guy's like, for the love of God, don't go that way. You're going to get killed. All right. They're having to do this kind of urban style warfare that they are just absolutely not used to at all. And, they're used to taking a nice open battlefield and being able to march their troops forward, use cavalry, stuff like that in a nice big open plain. Now they're fighting in the midst of cities where Spanish guerrilla attacks are happening on the outskirts of the city. The minute they take over one building and move on to the next, the Spanish come up and reclaim that building. It's full-blown chaos. And the Napoleonic troops don't know how to handle that. So during the Peninsular War, this second major mistake that Napoleon made, he lost 300,000 men during that war. And just to give you a little bit of a comparison, the United States in all of World War II lost about the same amount of men. And he lost 300,000 just in the Peninsular War alone. Why do they call it the Peninsular War? They call it that because it took place on the Iberian Peninsula. That's what the name of Spain and Portugal, the land that juts out, from Europe, is a peninsula, and it's called the Iberian Peninsula. So that's why it gets the name the Peninsular War. The application part is the significance, the why or how it's important to the class. One of the things that we're starting to see, all right, in Europe at this time is the rise of nationalism, and we're going to talk about nationalism more as we move forward here. But nationalism starts to be the biggest weapon used against Napoleon. Okay, we have to understand that in a previous time, people didn't have a lot of loyalty to their national ties in the same sense that they had it to the king of the state. But as time goes on, more and more and more people start to identify under a common national identity. And the reason that this is really difficult for Napoleon is because it doesn't matter if you subdue Austria. It doesn't matter if you subdue Spain. It doesn't matter if you subdue the British, because you can't force those people to start feeling French. Okay? The minute that you lose control of that area, all right, or the minute that you show a sign of weakness, their national identity is going to inspire them to revolt against you. And in this case, when I say you, I mean Napoleon. So Napoleon had exerted military dominance over these places and subdued them. But you can't truly take them over if the spirit that these people identify with is a spirit of nationalism that does not allow them to feel French or want to be controlled by the French. And so nationalism is this kind of ideal, this identity that people start to identify with their national ties rather than, just merely the king of whoever has taken them over. And that means that Napoleon is going to have a really hard time controlling places outside of France because he can't force them to feel French. All right. Peninsular War, here you can see the British assisting in their attacks against the Spanish. And then the last major mistake number 3 that Napoleon makes that ultimately leads to his downfall is invading Russia. And just as a little bit of a spoiler alert here, it's not going to be the last time that somebody makes a mistake by invading Russia. And if you know your history pretty well, you might know that I'm already talking about Adolf Hitler in World War II, who famously decided to invade Russia, which was the beginning of the end for the Nazis during World War II. And so this is going to be a mistake that Napoleon makes about 130 years earlier. The Russian leader, the Tsar, which is the title of the king of Russia, is Tsar of Russia. The Russian Tsar at this time is a guy by the name of Alexander I. Now, Alexander I had actually been an ally of Napoleon. They were buddies, okay? And believe it or not, they kind of have a little bit of a bromance, okay? They're kind of they're close, they're chummy with one another, and but basically Napoleon starts. I forget what it was. I think it was that Napoleon starts, like, I don't know what, maybe fooling around with his sister or something like that. I forget exactly what the thing was that happened, but Alexander I kind of turns on Napoleon. And Napoleon turns on Alexander I too, because remember that Continental System that I had told you about. One of the things that Russia wanted to do was trade with Britain. Okay, Russia wanted to trade with Britain. And Napoleon had said, hey, Russia, Alexander I, we're supposed to be allies. If you want to be a real ally to me, you need to stop trading with Britain. And Alexander I was like, I know. We're not going to trade with Britain anymore. Da-da-da-da-da-da. But then they keep trading with Britain. And the Russian Tsar has reasons that he wants to do this, and that's because Russia, being huge and being in the place that it is geographically, was kind of blocked out of a lot of trade. And so they keep trading with Britain and circumventing this continental system that Napoleon had been trying to establish. And when Napoleon finds out that Russia has been trading with Britain, which is France's #1 enemy, this alliance between Napoleon and Alexander breaks. And Napoleon says, how dare you, basically, how dare you cheat on me, all right? I already told you, Arnav, it's the how or why it's significant to the chapter. The definition is who, what, when, where, The significance is how or why it's important. Okay? So the alliance breaks and Napoleon decides to attack Russia. So in June of 1812, Napoleon and 420,000 soldiers march into Russia, and June is a good time to attack Russia. June's a great time to attack Russia. The Russian weather is tolerable in the summertime, and the tactic that Alexander I used is something called scorched earth policy. And what scorched earth policy was this idea where every time that Napoleon thought that he was going to be able to engage the Russians on the battlefield, what the Russians would do is they would retreat. And as they would retreat, they would burn down their own lands, leave it to Russia to be burning down literally their own lands, killing their own livestock, as this massive Napoleonic force of nearly 500,000 men marches into their country. And so as the Russians are pulling back, he burns down all these fields, he kills the livestock. And the reason that he's doing that is because when you have a massive army of 500,000 people, they can't just march endlessly. They're human beings. They have to eat. They have to be able to survive off the land that they're marching across. So if you scorch your own earth, that means it's going to be basically really difficult for them they're going to have to supply their troops from behind and bring in reinforcements and bring in provisions for the troops to be able to eat and stay supplied. And so this, Russia, by the way, is absolutely enormous. And so, before you get to anywhere of notability in Russia, you have to march across, thousands of miles from France into the interior of Russia to get to, say, Moscow, okay, or St. Petersburg or something like that. Now, Napoleon and his troops are marching into Russia. Every time they think that they're going to attack the Russians pull back, burn down more land. And it ultimately culminates in this battle called the Battle of Borodino. And at the Battle of Borodino, the Battle of Borodino results in finally the French and the Russians meet on the battlefield, and the French are victorious in the Battle of Borodino. But once again, the remaining Russian troops, this is just outside of Moscow, the remaining Russian troops evacuate the battlefield and retreat into Moscow. Napoleon is coming up over a hill, and he sees like this glow over the hill. He's like, what in the heck is that? He comes up and he sees Moscow is in flames. He hasn't even entered Moscow yet. The capital city of Russia, well, it's not really quite the capital city, but yet St. Petersburg was. But nonetheless, this major city, Moscow, is already up in flames. And Napoleon's like, what? Are these people insane? Like, they just set on fire one of their biggest cities, right? And we haven't even gotten there yet. And so he comes up, and this is kind of an artistic depiction of what he sees in Moscow. Moscow's in flames, all right? And Napoleon doesn't really know what to do with this. And by now, it's not June anymore. They've been marching for months. It's September, and the weather is starting to turn. And so they are invading Russia. September 7th is that Battle of Borodino Battle of Borodino. And the Russians fall back and allow Napoleon to move into Moscow. But when he enters the city, it's already burning down, because Alexander I, the Tsar of Russia, ordered the city of Moscow to be burned so that the French troops wouldn't be able to take it over. So Napoleon goes into Moscow. He's trying to regain control of Moscow, but the whole city's in flames. It's chaos. And so he hangs around there for about a month or so, but the weather's starting to turn. He can't regain control over Moscow because the city is just a mess. And so in October, he's like, well, I guess we'll go home then. But now it's the start of winter. And winter is a very, very bad time to be in Russia, particularly for the French. Because the way that the French uniforms worked was the metal clasps that they used to close their coats were made out of tin. And if you know anything about tin, if you freeze tin, it becomes very, very, very brittle. And so the clasps on all of their uniforms freeze and they break. And so all of the tin that they used in their metal clasps crumble. They can't close their coats anymore. And now they're marching back, and it's not summertime anymore, it's wintertime now. And so they start heading back to France, but they have to cover all that same ground, which was literally just burned down a couple months earlier. And then the ground freezes. And when the ground freezes, it becomes as hard as a rock because the ground has a lot of moisture in it. So you can't even bury your dead or anything like that, okay? If you try and use a shovel and dig into frozen land, good luck with that, okay? You're going to break the shovel before you break the dirt. And so Napoleon's marching back. They're freezing to death. They're starving to death. Meanwhile, now the Russians start attacking Napoleon from behind. And so cold, hunger, exhaustion end up absolutely destroying the French forces, not to mention these raids that are attacking from Russian troops from behind. And out of the 420,000 men that Napoleon sent into Russia, only 10,000 of them returned home. That is an attrition rate of ridiculous proportions. I don't even know what is that. %, 2.4% of his troops return home. Okay, a 97.5, 97.6% attrition rate, death rate. Okay, that is huge. Okay, that is really, really devastating. And here you can see a painting that was done after the fact of Napoleon's retreat. So here you can see his troops freezing, starving, exhausted, many of them laying on the ground there. And that's the beginning of the end for Napoleon. This is Napoleon's downfall. So after the fall of his great army, now all of the other places that Napoleon had subdued realize this is their window of opportunity. They know Napoleon has made a huge, huge mistake by doing this, and he is defeated in a battle known as the Battle of Leipzig. The Battle of Leipzig, L-I-E-P. Okay, whoops, Leipzig. Okay, the Battle of Leipzig, and so he was defeated at the Battle of Leipzig against Allied forces of the Prussians, the Swedish, the British, the Russians, and the Austrians. They all come in together on the same side against Napoleon, and he is defeated in October of 1813. And just a short couple of months later, Russian and Prussian troops, Prussians being Germans, marched towards Paris, and Napoleon's generals, after his military has been decimated, refused to fight for him anymore. And in April of 1814, he accepts surrender, and he was exiled to the island of Elba off the coast of Italy in the Mediterranean Sea. So Napoleon is captured, and they send him to this island of Elba in the Mediterranean. But it would not be the last time that we hear from Napoleon, and that, my friends, is where we will pick up the story next time. And you'll have a new vocab assignment today dealing with terms relating to Napoleon, and I will make that due for Tuesday of next week. So that is the end of class today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time.